and upon what you do in the charter. And we'd like any comments that either of you gentlemen might have in the way of starters. Any thoughts you might have, then we'll ask such questions that may appear. Bob?
Well, I just put down 4 thoughts as far as municipal bonding is concerned. And looking over the last chart, the 1971 chart. And maybe I'll just run through them in order. Because of the periods of very high interest rates that municipalities are forced to pay these days, fluctuating interest rates, we're getting into refunding areas where municipalities are finding it very desirable to go back and issue new bonds to pay off their old bonds, saving a substantial amount of money. It would be desirable from a bond counsel's viewpoint, although I don't think absolutely necessary, if the authority section, which gave the municipality the power to borrow money, also stated that this power includes and is authorized, municipality is authorized to refund any existing indebtedness. I think simply a mention of the refunding power would be of assistance, although I say not necessarily essential. The previous charter, in section 1004, required a public sale of all bonds by the municipality, qualifying it by saying you could, in section C, you could negotiate purchases with state or federal governments, and if you didn't get any bids that you liked, then you could go and negotiate sale to private parties. I would think it's more desirable to leave this to the discretion of the Assembly, as it is generally now, that they sell at a public or private sale as they determine best. There are 2 circumstances where I think this is helpful. One, you may have a very, very small issue or an issue which is not nationally marketable, and I'm thinking particularly of an occasion or 2 where we've sold obligations of service areas alone. Now, while we have okayed service area bond for a particular purpose, that type of bond is simply not marketable nationally. Nobody's going to buy a less than a general obligation of the entire municipality. And in many, many cases, they're very small, too. So, there's no harm, indeed, I would think probably a great advantage simply to go down to a local bank, which is what has been done, and negotiate a sale privately without the necessity of going through a public system. Those are the small oddball type of issues where there wouldn't be any point going to a public sale. And the other circumstance is the type of thing we're getting into right now, where the bond markets are chaotic and probably will continue to be. And if you have, as you commonly have in this area, an interest rate limitation voted on by the people, you may be up to a point where you might not just get unfavorable bids, you might get no bids at all. A standpoint of how you present yourself to the bond markets, that's not a good idea at all. We had a recent issue which was not a general obligation issue, but one which was advertised for sale, and when the sale date came, this was just in the last month or so, there were no bids. It's highly embarrassing to the borrower, to say the least. So it may, due to economic conditions, be desirable not to go to a public sale on a certain issue with an interest rate limitation, but to see if you can't get an underwriter that will negotiate an interest rate without having to go and get a slap in the face in public. So I think that to leave that to the sound discretion of the Assembly would be much better. And there hasn't really been any trouble that I can see. I mean, the Assembly's public bodies are very, very reluctant to have a private sale. It would only be in the odd situation that you would have it. From a political viewpoint, of course, they want very much to have it as public as possible. So I don't think there's too much danger of nefarious things going on if you allow them the option of going to public or private sale. I think Section 1006 or similar language, which was a limitation on a challenge to a particular issue or an election, which in that case said that no suit could be commenced challenging the validity of the obligations, bond ratification, election, levy of taxes, and pay the obligation unless it was begun within 30 days from the date of certification results of the election. And this, of course, came, as you probably all know, from the repeated suits that were filed against the Greater Anchorage area borough by Wilkie Jefferson. There were a couple of other kinds that were filed in other communities. Many of which repeated things that have been ruled upon by the court before, but all of which had to be told to the potential buyers, and which did nothing but cost this community money, not just money to defend. That was a small part of it, but probably millions of dollars in extra interest they had to pay because they had to go to market with the litigation reported on the bonds. And this does not stop the litigation. Of course, you can't do that, nor would you want to do that. But some reasonable limitation on going after what people have voted on is very, very desirable. Mr. Chairman?
All right. Bob, do you think that such a inclusion in the charter would protect us enough so that they still couldn't do it?
Well, no, you can't cut them off. You can't cut them off. That's not possible. But yes, it will protect you. I mean, it simply says people can't hang back in the woods and then try to go after technicalities. What they really want to do is make trouble for the municipality, which is what happened. I mean, if there's something wrong with the election, if there's something wrong with the taxes that are pledged to pay it for this particular issue, then they've got to put up or shut up. And in 30 days, and then I mean, you can't, for example, you don't sell an authorization right away. You may vote $10 million, and you may not sell it for 6 months. And well, as a matter of fact, I think the borough commonly, for example, for their road program, tries to vote at least a year ahead. There'll be at least a year spread before you sell your bonds. So, by the time you really get ready to gear up, you want to make sure that there's no possibility that somebody's going to come right while you're having a sale, you see, and mess you up. By the time you go to the sale, you'll have it all over with. So,
would a court sustain a 30-day limitation of that nature?
oh, I think so. I mean, such limitations are common. I mean, I think 30 days is a reasonable limitation. I mean, I haven't done any research. I'm sure if you cut it down to 2 or 3 days or something like that, you can't be ridiculous about it. A reasonable time, I'm sure will be available.
So I remember, Bob, you did a great deal of research on that particular item at the
Did I?
time. But it's been 4 years.
It's been 4 years, so the other comment. Oh, I'm sorry.
I had thought, somewhere in the back of my mind, that there was a Supreme Court case in Alaska on private municipal statutes of limitations in other situations, tort claims. Do you know?
Oh, on tort claims?
Would that?
I don't know. The tort claims limitations, of course, are very common in almost all municipalities. And the old charter had one of those too, but I don't remember that specific.
limitation that, or a notice provision requiring that the municipality could require that it be given notice within, I don't recall, it was 60 days or 90 days after the happening of the tort. If the notice was not complied with, then there was no possibility of seeking redress.
Yeah, in other words, if there is such a recent case, and if 60 days was held reasonable for purposes of a tort, it might suggest a period of time on this.
The other thing, which is like would probably be the most controversial of all, and so I won't really say anything about it from a political viewpoint, but just from a finance viewpoint. The last charter in section 809C had a restriction that the municipality may not acquire by lease purchase agreement a capital improvement valued in excess of $1 million unless approved by the voters in the same manner as general obligation bonds intended. That method of financing has got quite common for a while here. It's ASHA type or the borough building type of financing where you have either a non-profit corporation, which is the alter ego of the municipality, or you could even have a state agency as ASHA. It's not a legal obligation of the municipality. It's backed by the lease.
It's not a illegal or
It is not a legal obligation. It's not a legal debt to the municipality. The only obligation the municipality has is to pay rent. So therefore, it is not an obligation or a debt to the municipality that falls under the constitutional requirements that such debt has to be voted upon, you see. And, of course, that's where the controversy comes from. They're called backdoor financing because what you, in effect, do is build a public improvement without going to the voters. It really got its start, if I remember correctly, because the voters of the state back in 1960 or somewhere around then turned down a bond issue for the state courthouse. And what the state had to do, because Joe, you probably remember better than I, seems to me that weren't they going to get kicked out of the federal building or something like that. So what they did, a private entrepreneur built the old court, what is now the old state courthouse, and rented it to the state of Alaska. Substantial lease payment.
substantial is the word.
Substantial. And not only was the rent substantial, but the state wasn't going to end up with the building. It didn't own the building. It was just a renter. So to correct that situation, ASHA bought the building and then leased it to the state with tax-exempt financing, of course. A much better deal for the taxpayers, and as a matter of fact, they acquired the building. So they own the building. The difficulty is people just don't vote for government buildings. It's that simple. So it forces a municipality to go out and lease facilities which they have to have at a less desirable cost, and a facility which they will not acquire, or they will not own. They do not own if they acquire through some sort of financing. So controversial as it is, and I think that the controversy is an impediment on any assembly anyway. There may be circumstances where, in the judgment of the assembly, and I think there are circumstances, there are lots of circumstances, where it is in the public interest to have facilities that they need at the lowest possible cost to the taxpayer, facilities that they will own. And controversial or not, this is a method whereby they can acquire it. There are also other types of things that they can do, not just facilities, but you can build what would be considered public type structures that can be leased to private managers or operators, which is in effect a type of revenue bond that one in Juneau, which is a medical building adjacent to the public hospital, which have no impact whatsoever on the taxes. They're not paid for taxes. The facility does support through its rentals, non-public rentals, the bond payments, and you can use the lease purchase arrangement without any impact on taxes to accomplish that. Again, tax-exempt finance. So I would simply suggest is a device to finance on a tax-exempt basis, lower the cost to the public that may be desirable. And I would think that a restriction written in the charter would be too much of a limitation on specific circumstances where the assembly might determine that the public would be benefited by using that device.
Mr. Chairman?
Comments?
On using a lease purchase method, is it possible to say, since it is not a liability of the municipality, would you tend to run toward higher costs?
Oh, yes. There's no question about it. The rates for such bonds are generally higher than the rates for general obligation
Now,
bonds.
they would not be a tax exempt bond.
Oh, yes. They are tax
They would be a tax
Yes.
exempt bond, but at a percentage point or something
Yes,
like that.
the security is a shade lower than a general obligation bond. However, it is a tax exempt bond. The IRS considers a nonprofit corporation that it's really the alter ego of the municipality, and as long as it is what they would consider in the area of a public purpose and the residual, that is, the building ends up in public hands. That's always the criteria. The building ends up in public hands. Then they will issue an opinion, a ruling that these are tax exempt.
Right.
So what you have is it's a middle type thing. In other words, if you went out and you had to lease space, you're paying a lot more. You don't get the building. If for one reason or other, for public reaction, you can't get a general obligation bond, you'll have to pay a little bit higher interest rate, but you get a cheaper than the rent, and you get the building.
Okay, then the other question would be, if you use this approach I'm not at all familiar with, the revenue bond approach, I would assume then that you are talking of not having a limitation as the city of Anchorage does now, where the revenue bond must go to for voter approval. You would perhaps not have that limitation, then would sell revenue bonds, and again, we would be speaking, would we not, or would we, of a higher rate? Would that be backed? That would be backed by the full faith and credit of the
No.
borough?
No.
It would not?
No, revenues. Well, the city, right, does have that requirement that they have to go to the voters. It's probably more common than not that revenue bonds, which are not paid from taxes, are not voted on.
All right,
But-
let's assume that the body would have the ability to issue the
Right.
revenue bonds. Then, what is the status of a revenue bond? It is secured merely by
The revenues.
the revenues,
Correct.
and could not go back against the general.
That's right. That's right.
And do they tend to run at a higher rate?
Yes.
How do they compare?
Oh, that's very hard to say because it really depends on the facility that you're selling for. Because then the respective purchaser looks very carefully at your revenue flow as to what its real coverage is. So they could vary substantially. But
Nick, I have some things I'd like to get into with Bob, but I don't know for sure that he's finished with what
I
he
am.
had to say. Okay.
I'm sorry, I can't answer your question, but there would be a difference that would be significant. I mean, there's no question about it. In interest costs or revenue versus a general obligation bond, it's a significant difference as far as what the municipality is.
The taxpayer was smart, in other words, did vote for office space instead of the taxpayer was smart. Ha! All right.
Nick, would it be fair to state, or is it a practice of the Anchorage municipality and the other municipalities in the state and the other municipalities, in fact, out of the state, to pick up with general revenues from tax sources even, a defaulted revenue bond issue. Or do they ever default?
Huh?
Do they ever default?
Oh, yes.
All right. What happens when they do?
It's common to do it, but by no means universal. There are toll authorities, for example, independent toll authorities of states for toll roads that haven't met their obligation, and states do not pick them up. There are other things like what I assume is not ever going to be tried again, called the moral obligation. The state says, well, there's no legal obligation to pay, but we have a moral obligation. Well, that's the urban development type of situation.
New York.
New York, and that's and they, well, I don't know. There was some money put into that. I haven't followed it that closely. Some let them go. On the other hand, it is a common practice to keep up your image in the bond markets, to in certain circumstances dig in and in effect lend the utility or whatever it is the money to keep current. And I'm trying to remember, it seems to me the city of Anchorage did that at least once with the port revenue bonds at the very beginning.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was once or twice, but I believe they did kick in some money because the revenues at that point were not sufficient to pay the bonds. So to keep up their image, the city did that.
My impression that that's the case, and sometimes it's rather indirect. In other words, I think the city at that time bought some land or something from the port. Yeah. I mean, it was, but anyway, it funneled some money to them. The impression I know I got the last time we'd gone through this is that whether it's revenue or a GO bond, the full faith and credit of the municipality is in essence pledged anyway. And that's why I don't know, in fact I don't know what the last charter said even, whether it required a vote for revenue bonds as well as GO bonds. It did not.
Did not require a vote
For revenue bonds. But I know this was a consideration, and it's something we're going to have to think about.
Is that issue?
Well, it's, pardon?
Exactly, no. Are you referring to a specific section, Dick, and some wording that would help get it in my mind?
No, not really. I don't know where it appears in the charter, as a matter of fact. You have a note offhand?
I think it'd be helpful.
Restrictions on borrowing?
1002.
Page 16.
1002.
Restrictions on borrowing.
All right, it says no general obligation bond of indebtedness may be incurred unless authorized by the Assembly and ratified by the majority vote of those in the municipality voting on the question. Now, it says general obligation bond and indebtedness. Well, that exempts, of course, revenue bond indebtedness.
That's what I was trying to get to. That's what you
The question for this body will be whether that will in fact be the wording, or it will state no bonded indebtedness. And there was some controversy about that last time. I don't know. Looking back, well, give us your wisdom on that, would you, Bill?
Well,
I
don't know if I have.
Let me. Well, here's my fear. The one fear I would have about that would be that there would be a general tendency to go through to the revenue bond method of financing, and at a generally higher cost than the general obligation bond method of financing. And
well, yes, but Dick, you're limited by the fact that the facility that you're going to finance, you've got to sit down and you're going to sell it on a revenue basis, and you've got to show the prospective buyer that the revenues are going to be there and there's going to be coverage. And sell is a purely revenue bond. Now, sometimes you can pump it up. I think we've had a lot of big stadium racetracks, Lord knows what else, built, some of them with revenue bonds, and some of them in default because they haven't gotten their team, or the races just haven't turned out the way they were supposed to, or something like that. But in any event, if you're going to sell a revenue bond, you've got to show there's revenue there. It's not something you can turn to as an alternative if you can't get a GO bond.
And if it's iffy, the bond market is in fact going to say, no, we won't take it, or we'll give it a very high rate, or won't they in fact say, well, the municipality is really going to end up picking this up if it falls?
No, I don't think they're going to say that, because while some municipalities in certain circumstances have kicked in, it is by no means universal, and I do not think that a bond buyer is going to consider that in effect it is full faith and credit. They won't look at that at all. They'll just say, if the revenue's not there, we pass.
Mr. Joseph, Mr. Glencoe, how real a limitation is that? For example, if you were going to finance bicycle paths, the probability is you couldn't use a revenue bond, right? Unless you get tolls.
I don't know who'd buy a revenue bond on a bicycle.
But a lot of things that people might want to vote on, like sewer facilities and so forth, could be done on a revenue basis. A lot of the things that we would normally think about for
Yes.
public improvements, with an allegation that the revenue would be there to the state.
Well, you could issue revenue bonds on a sewer system and pledge the charge insurance.
Mr. Chairman,
Harlan?
I don't think, though, we should lose sight of the very sophisticated bond market there is, and the ability to sell those at a rate. And you jolly well don't go around issuing revenue bonds on something that's not a pretty standard practice and pretty well adopted. I think that the market itself might determine saleability and utilization of some of these bonds.
Mr. Chairman,
Mary?
we've been hearing in the last 6 months of sewer bonds being sold, revenue bonds, somewhere, I believe, Kansas City, and others. I still haven't heard what the rate is. Have you?
No.
What kind of bond, ma'am?
Sewer bonds,
Sherry?
revenue bonds.
I'd like at this point to have some input from Bertram, who's here. His firm handles bonding for the city.
Yes. And the basic difference is instead of using the state statutes as an authority, we use the city charter as our authority for issuing bonds, which does require the election on both revenue and GO bond issues. And I have just a few more things just to add to what Bob has said. He's pretty well covered the existing, or the last charter. But we would like to see the authority section spelled out a little bit on what obligations consist of. In other words, general obligation bonds, revenue bonds, bond anticipation notes, tax anticipation notes, refunding bonds, so that it can be tied in a little better with the rest of your report, the rest of your section. Under manner of sale, for instance, you've listed notes shall be transferred or delivered for value in such public manner as the assembly shall provide by ordinance. Nowhere is a note defined. And since if you left the restriction that GO bonds had to be approved by the public at an election and didn't define notes, it's possible under the current movement to issue 20-year notes instead of general obligation bonds and avoid your election. So it's for reasons such as this that I think the authority section should define exactly what you're authorizing, the different types of borrowing. The restrictions on borrowing section, is really just too stringent because that doesn't authorize refunding bonds at all. Normally, refunding bonds have a market which is something that's really negotiated at a private sale instead of at a public sale. And under the current, or under this draft, it would be difficult to refund existing GO bonds without going back to the voters, which I think is Bob's suggestion. The notice of bond election section, we don't think is really necessary at all. That is pretty well spelled out in the state statutes. In your regular
That whole
notice of
section?
election, the whole section could be eliminated.
Excuse me, Irv, did you check to see whether that statute applies to home rule municipalities?
Well, it doesn't apply as a limitation on the powers, if I recall correctly. So, in other words, a home rule municipality doesn't have to follow those restrictions. But that doesn't mean that it can't use the existing statute as the set of restrictions.
But it would need to provide for it.
Some of our conversations on other sections tie anything to Title 29 or state statutes which are able to be changed. It was kind of one of the practices before to avoid because they're always maintaining the form of government.
Then,
I'm having a little bit of difficulty hearing.
I'm sorry, I'll speak up.
Or
I was real quiet.
appreciate it if you could speak up just a little bit more.
Well, Mr. Chairman, Irv,
Sherry?
I wonder if that section 1003 could be condensed into a statement that the Assembly shall provide for notice by ordinance, rather than spelling out the procedures. How important is it that we put in the charter what the procedures for notice should be?
I don't think it's very important if there is adequate notice given. But I'm trying to recall, I don't believe the city charter spells out the notice of election provisions, but they're commonly spelled out in the bond ordinances that the city passes at its meetings, which call for the election. That sets up the specific notice requirements.
Actually, we could leave it out. No point in having it. Bob, how do you feel? How do you feel about leaving it out? Sure. Doesn't
Do
contribute.
you have any question from bond buyers about things like that? I mean, does it add anything to the sale of a bond? Does it make it any more viable for purchasers?
Normally not. I don't think that bond buyers look at the ordinance or the charter as carefully as they look at the notice of bond election. And the rest of, or the bond ordinance that's authorizing the particular bond issue, the ratio of the, if it's a GO issue, the ratio of property values to current indebtedness, for instance, is important. If it's a revenue issue, the ratio of current indebtedness to the revenues of the utility in question.
The form then doesn't give them very much problem as far as either selling the bonds or negotiating the sale of bonds.
The form of the notice of sale, or
Well, no, the format, better put the format back of the ordinances.
well, in some sections it could give or create difficulties. For instance,
It's already in.
the this particular charter would create difficulties with refunding bonds. But as far as the notice section is concerned, I don't think it's necessary. That could be handled by the Assembly's ordinance that's actually calling for the bond election.
Let me just clarify, and I don't mean to be interrupting you because I think you have some more points, but it could give problems with refunding bonds because of the restrictions on borrowing section. Is that
Yes.
the reason? No general obligation may be incurred except for capital improvements. That's the statement.
That's one statement, which is a limitation. The other statement is the general obligation bonds must be voted on by a majority, must be ratified by a
Okay,
majority of the
fine.
voters.
Fine.
A refunding bond.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, are other municipalities in the habit of using GO bonds for other things than capital improvements?
Well, in this state, capital improvements, well, you can't have bonded indebtedness for anything but capital improvements. It's in the state constitution. That's a limitation on what you can do with it.
I was just wondering whether others did. Is it common other places to do it?
No.
New York City is now deeply in the hole because using
Tax
general
anticipation.
obligation indebtedness
Thank you.
to pay their operating expenses.
Should there be a prohibition in the charter speaking to that?
It's as Irv says, it's really redundant because our state constitution simply prohibits. But the old charter did, or the 71 charter did repeat that prohibition.
I thought, pardon me, I thought the prohibition was for the state.
I think that it covers all borrowing, all public borrowing. Fairly sure it's defined in terms of public borrowing and not just the state's borrowing.
Well, I think there may be duplicate provisions in the state borrowing title and the local government sector. But I mean,
Could we ask Rick to check on that? I think it's something we ought to know. It's
So that if,
perhaps a little bit.
let me get this straight so I ask him the right thing. If it does cover it in the Constitution, we might be able to omit the sentence, no general obligation bonded indebtedness may be incurred except for capital improvements, right?
Let's find out what state law says about GO or general obligation indebtedness for capital improvements or operating expenses.
I have it, but I don't know where to look.
Let's see, going further, under manner of sale, again, I think that's been covered on the private. We also believe that a private sale should be permitted in at least the case of revenue bonds and, of course, refunding bonds. But that's really a public policy question. That's something that you really have to address yourselves to as to whether you want to permit municipal borrowing through a private negotiated sale, or do you want the voters to vote on every bonded indebtedness that's incurred?
Mr. Chairman, we have found in the Constitution, no debt shall be contracted by any political subdivision of the state unless authorized for capital improvements by its governing body and ratified by a majority vote of those qualified to vote and voting on the question. So that
It's clear.
absolutely wrong. Sorry to interrupt.
It's quite all right.
Cut that down to municipality may borrow money and issue evidence thereof.
Was this a 7-page charter or 9, Frank?
Figure from one.
Right.
May borrow money is not otherwise prohibited in any means not otherwise prohibited by law. Leave it at that. Now, the next section on section 1005, which is sale to financial consultants prohibited, that section is all right, although it's a little ambiguous in that it doesn't really define itself or limit itself to current financial consultants. For instance, does it mean financial consultant who is consulting on a particular bond issue or tax anticipation, or rather anticipation note that is being debated by the council at the time? How many financial consultants do you have? What is a financial consultant? These are things that create some ambiguity, and this section should be, or could be clarified to some extent.
Mr. Chairman, how would we go about clarifying it? Can you propose some positive wording? This perhaps is a pretty specialized field, isn't it?
I would not attempt to do so within the next 5 minutes.
Well, no, but could you
Yes.
provide, say, Rick Garnett, some possible wording for that?
Succinct word.
That
Yeah,
fits
okay.
in with the, easy to read, clearly understood.
Short.
Need 2 words or less.
And the last item that I looked at, but only briefly, is the section on transition in the old charter, or in the 1971 charter, which basically, it's on page 21, section 1406E. It says, any bond of a former government authorized and unissued on the date of ratification remains authorized and may be issued at the discretion of the Assembly without additional ratification and subject to the procedures provided by law. That can create some very severe problems, or at least legal challenges. And at this point, I don't have any idea of how to avoid it. Perhaps Bob's thought more about it. But what you have is 2 different government bodies. For instance, the city currently has $10 million in telephone revenue bonds that are authorized for the telephone revenue. Well, let's not use that. Say the city had a general obligation bond issue for fire equipment of $1 million that had been ratified by the city voters. Well, after unification, those bonds, utilizing a section like this, the city could sell those bonds, or the Assembly could, but the money could be spent in another area. And the full faith and credit of the entire borough would then be affected, or the entire government body, by something that just the voters of one portion, a smaller portion, had ratified. Now, for fire equipment, that may not be a problem, but it might be if you had something like a sports stadium, or something that was a larger impact.
Let me
Sure.
try and think this through. This would only apply to city bond issues because borough bond issues have been voted on by everyone.
Yes,
So,
unless you have bond issues that are dealing with just one service area, for instance. Through the unification process, somehow the service area concept got lost or changed, so that there was an attempt to use those bonds in other areas.
Well, Mr. Chairman, just to follow through on it, let's assume we now have city exercises library service, the borough non-area-wide library service, which is in effect the large service area. And they have $1 million worth of bonds that are authorized. Okay, that we go ahead and create area-wide service, one, in effect, service area throughout the whole thing. And it's spent within that area. That situation would have no impact because they're the same number of people really that voted would be paid back on it. But is it the only problem would be that if, for instance, that where a certain number of city voters voted for it, it becomes area-wide and everybody, say, would be paying back on that. Does that create a problem?
That's the problem.
That's the problem.
Where you have people who have the really would have the right to object in that they had not ratified the expenditure or the bonded indebtedness because they hadn't had the opportunity to vote on it. If it's a general obligation bond issue, because they were outside the city area, for instance. And now you're trying to issue those bonds on a full faith and credit of the
Just if I could pursue just one question on that. Now, as far as the purchaser of that, the bond market, there may be a cloud, but they would actually have greater security. So the problem would really come from a possible protest of the citizenry. Wouldn't that be the...
Yes, but all municipal bonds are sold with the legal opinion of bond counsel saying that they cannot foresee any legal impediment to
and
the
it could create one.
Sherry?
Mr. Chairman, to what extent does the voting on this charter indicate that acceptance of previous bond sales? I mean, if there is this provision in the charter, can it be construed as authorization?
That's an interesting question. I would like to say yes, but I'm not really sure.
One of the things I think ought to be pointed out, I'm not so sure that under this Section E, as a matter of fact, I would think not, this would automatically spread an authorization so that it can be full faith and credit of the entire new municipality. It seems like it just carries over the status quo as it was before, so that if you sold a city issue someplace, that the ratification of this charter thereby extends the full faith and credit to the entire municipality. But of course, I'd have to research it before I'd be reluctant to issue an opinion on a former city issue under this section that purported to carry with it the full faith and credit of the whole municipality. I don't think that section does that. Well, I see a problem if they tried to make it the full faith and credit of the whole area. And I also see a marketing problem if you tried to. What you would have then would be a service area bond of a large service area in effect, or a portion of the municipality. And just as a marketing point of view, they don't really like that. I mean, what they like is the full faith and credit of the municipality and all of it. That's why when you have service area bonds here, everybody votes on it, so it can be full faith and credit, even though only the service areas are going to pay it, because people don't want service area bonds. They want the bonds of the whole community.
The community then is
That's
lending
right.
the full faith and credit.
But I don't think you have the power, under this draft of the old charter, there was, of course, and under the statute, talked about spreading the existing debt. But this isn't existing debt. This is unissued debt, unissued, unvoted potential obligations. And I don't know that you automatically would have the right, or the new assembly, or whoever, would automatically have the right to spread that unless it was somehow said that was the case here.
Is it appropriate to go on to another
Yes.
issue? I don't know whether Sherry catches this or I do, but we had a not great debate, but we did make a decision on the very beginning as to what we shall call this new municipality, and have opted for just simply that the municipal corporation shall be known as Anchorage. And we wondered whether it would be necessary to list in, say, the definition section that when it is in the public interest or appropriate to do so, that you would use the name of City and Borough of Anchorage. Is it necessary for bonding purposes that somewhere be pointed out, or can we just be the municipality of Anchorage? Ken?
Does it need anything, even municipality? Does it, can it just be Anchorage?
Well, we are. Well,
Merely just, I think, I suppose when you print up the bond and the notice of sale, I think you probably just write in, I don't think you need authority for it, say Anchorage, comma, a municipal corporation or something like that, or incorporated under the laws of the state of Alaska or something like that. I don't think you need to worry about it.
seems like Sitka and Juneau and everybody else that's ever tried at Fairbanks has always tried to bring in the city and the borough, and we've got feedback.
Well, we started off here under the state by issuing bonds of a borough, and what's a borough? We don't have boroughs in this country except in Alaska. So if you're going to, and they don't issue bonds. So if you're going to pick something strange, that you're going to try to show people, that causes trouble. But if you leave something out, I wouldn't.
Normally, too, when bonds are marketed, a prospectus is prepared and it goes into at some length into describing the city or the municipality as such. And that, I think, in the prospectus, that would be enough of an indication that you're talking about an area of so many square miles and so many thousand people with such and such a property value, and that's usually what's utilized and relied upon by your investors who are interested in buying bonds.
I think that we as a group feel that we'd like to make this, do anything in here that's going to make it easier for the city to finance that, from the standpoint of sale of the bonds, things of that nature. And if you have any suggestion, I know that we would welcome anything that you feel that you could put in writing as to suggested format for any of this, we would also appreciate. You have particular wording and given instances that appear to you to be reasonable and logical to use. We appreciate hearing from you.
How soon? We need this very quickly.
Your finance article is going to be
By 2 o'clock this afternoon?
Tuesday's meeting. We'll be considering the finance article at Tuesday meeting. If we could have something this afternoon, or Monday, or Monday or Tuesday morning.
Yeah, particularly I think that 1406E that Irv talked about. I'm sort of assuming, though, at this point, there isn't any solution to the problem. Or if it is, it's a rather verbose solution. And I wonder how big the problem is. I mean,
Maybe there aren't any.
that's right. Maybe we don't have a problem.
I believe he could tell us more about what the city has authorized than any of us can.
Well, but the city would be the people to check with, really.
All right, well, the city does have authorized and unissued bonds right now.
Are they just revenue?
As a matter of fact,
Oh, I'm sure there's parks and rec.
I think that there are GO issues, in fact, parks and rec issues. Part of the reason they're not issued, too, the city has some problems right now issuing revenue bonds because it's gotten in a revenue squeeze. So that we have authorizations that can't be utilized right now.
This wouldn't affect revenue.
No.
Not geographic.
No, this would just be GO, and the only ones I could think of would be parks and recreation and streets and bicycle paths, because there was a fire department bond, but I think that's an issue.
Well, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, could we just ask the city finance people and the borough finance people what the authorized unissued GO bonds are at the present time and when they're likely to be issued? Tell them.
We can get that.
Let's talk to them about our problem here.
I have one other question. Is it in relation to this year's budget that's causing this, or has this been true for several years? I was aware of
Primarily
it.
this year's budget.
It's this year's
It's
budget
starting-
that's causing the problem, is it not?
At least that I'm aware of, the telephone revenue bonds. One item too, if you check with the city, who wants to know what general obligation bond issues they're proposing to put on the next ballot too, because I assume that unless there is a special charter election, I don't recall right now, but if this charter is voted on along with a number of other issues, you could at that time create the general obligation, not indebtedness, but the ability to issue general obligation bonds at the time of the election.
Joe, you had a question. I'm sorry. Sherry?
I had a couple of things. We're looking at an August election on the charter, which would be the only thing on the ballot. And then that would wipe out, that's what we're heading for, that would wipe out the municipal elections in the fall, hopefully. The other thing is that the comments we'd like back from you relate to the sections in Article 10 for next Tuesday. We have a little bit more leeway on the Article 14 transition provisions. And Fred and Dick and a couple of the others are handling the transition section. I'd be particularly interested in knowing, Bob, your comments on 1004, the public and private sale. Could we delete section C entirely?
If you change section A to say sold at public or private sale, such then you would delete section C completely.
And I appreciate your coming.
Yes.
We'll appreciate these words.
Are there any other questions? Thank you.
I like experts. They always make things so tidy.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for coming. I appreciate it. No end, and if you do have some input, we would like to have it as soon as we reasonably give it.
In other words, Bob, you don't worry about it. We're dark
Yeah, really, those are the type of people.
While you were away, I took myself off your committee. Lisa on her request.
It's definitely
What committee?
everything that's been approved
I thought the committee didn't exist.
by the
It's part of the,
full session.
part of
What does it mean? Well,
the drafting committee.